So, ladies and gentlemen, I actually really hate talking about this topic because the news out of it is just, well, sometimes contradictory at best. There's many individuals that just want the news to be true whilst not looking at it objectively. Now, I must say that as an attorney, well, usually when I look at things, I have to be overly cautious because if I say to somebody that, yes, this is going to happen, and then it doesn't, I'm liable for it. That's just the way attorneys tend to work. So usually we're a lot more pessimistic about things than, the average individual. But before I get onto the main video, can I yet again remind you, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It really does help. So this is the news that apparently the first white South African refugees are due in the US next week. This is being reported by the New York Times. Now, very interestingly enough, I did quite a lot of, let's call it fact checking in order to be able to see if I could see anybody else talking about this. And the answer is I can't. Now, apparently the White House has not actually responded to Reuters' request for information with regarding to this, and the only actual individuals reporting on this are Reuters. So is this real or not? I'm not really sure. Now, originally the plan was that these Afrikaners would arrive on Monday, and apparently because of flight logistics and processing of the group, that's being delayed. So the question really is, well, have they got in or not? And if they have, as the Africana Act hasn't actually been approved by Congress, how exactly have they got in? And as I say, usually I'm loath to provide full-on legal advice when it comes through to a YouTube video, for obvious reasons. Obviously, the idea that I could potentially be sued for fake advice, I will usually keep that advice as bland and generic as possible. But in this instance, as everybody loves to hate on me for talking about this specific program, I thought I would actually go through this entirely. So let's actually look at the entire thing objectively as an attorney. So apparently the news at the moment is some 30 individuals have been approved. There's also news that up to 54 people have been approved. Frick, who knows? I really don't know. And I must say, even before I actually dissect what's gone on, I must say the American government has been really, really bad at communicating this program. As you will know, that on January the 20th, 2025, Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14155, entitled the Realigning the United States Refugee Admissions Program. And what he did is he temporarily suspended all refugee applications from various zones unless they were what's classed as special interest groups or priority groups. He then subsequently signed a second order on February 7th, 2025, which created such an exemption for Afrikaners, white South African Afrikaners of Dutch descent. Now, this order directly ordered the United States agencies to prioritize the resettlement of Afrikaners, citing racial discrimination in South Africa, specifically concerning land expropriation policies. Well, that's quite important because we don't really know whether he means racial discrimination or land expropriation policies and what you would actually have to show. Is it enough to say that there's a lot of BE legislation? That's enough. Is it that you can say that your land could be expropriated? Is that enough? The answer is, well, we don't actually know. Now, obviously, this specific order drew a lot of controversy from South Africa. It criticized the US, saying that basically it didn't really understand its programs and its policies, and that became immaterial. Now, in order to actually give Executive Order 14204, the addressing the onerous actions of the Republic of South Africa order, as it's been called, the Africana Act was proposed. The act itself has not yet been passed into law. So what the act would do is it would basically create a legal framework in order to allow Afrikaners to gain settlements in the United States. Now, that act hasn't actually been passed. So a lot of us are waiting to see whether or not it will be accepted. But in any case, the current executive order could potentially still be used by the US Refugee Admission Program, the US RAP, for the authorization of refugee programs or applications to go to the United States. But these would obviously be based on a case-by-case exemption. Now, the Africana Act, which would go under HR 2607, was proposed on the 2nd of April, and this bill specifically would aim to give South African residents priority 2 refugee status as special humanitarian concerns, or cases of special humanitarian concerns. But the bill, as I said, hasn't actually been passed yet. Now, the issue is, can you still then go to the United States underneath the existing United States Refugees Admission Program, US RAP? And the answer technically is, well, yes, you could. So how this typically tends to work is that you would be referred to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, the UNHCR, or US embassies or designated NGOs, where you would create your application based on a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership of social group. That's the general criteria. That persecution, if you would, that well-founded fear of persecution would then be assessed by the Department of Homeland Security. So they would conduct background checks, interviews, you'd pass special vetting, medical screening, and you'd have to demonstrate refugee status as defined by US law. Now, the definition of that is subdivided into 2 sections. You get what's called Priority 1 or P1, which is individual referrals from US embassies or UNHCRs, or Priority 2, which is group referrals of special humanitarian concerns. So this would be Afrikaners as a group saying, well, we're being persecuted as a group. Now, the reason that P2 status is quite important is that it allows you to access a refugee program without referral to a US embassy or the UNHCR, the United States High Commission for Refugees. Now, in order to apply for something underneath Priority 2 or P2, you have to do it outside of the country of origin. In other words, you have to do it outside of the United States. And the United States would obviously have to go through a vetting process via forms of interview. Now, this is interesting because there has been some suggestion that the United States have been conducting interviews in South Africa, which would suggest potentially that this is exactly what's been taking place. So the question would be, what is the well-founded fear of persecution? Well, this is defined in the United States underneath the Refugee Act of 1980. And it is subjected or split into 2 specific parts. The first is subjective fear, that you personally fear persecution if you return to your country. And the second is objective fear, which is that the fear is reasonable based on evidence that someone in your situation has been or could be persecuted. So someone in your situation, it doesn't necessarily have to be that it would be to you specifically, but it would be that you, as part of that category of individuals, could be based to the same situational persecution, and the fear needs to be reasonable. So the way that you would typically evidence this would be things like police reports, where you could show threats or attacks or lack of any form of protection. You could use medical records. You could use newspaper articles. Potentially, I suppose you could use videos from channels such as these, articles out of AfriForum, for example. You could use laws or policies. So specifically, you could use the land expropriation bills or the exclusion from public services via some of those acts. You could also show employment records where you can show that you've lost your job due to race, religion, or political views. So the way that you would do this is you could get written affidavits or personal statements detailing who persecuted or threatened you, why you were targeted, specific incidents and dates, and making statements based on that evidence on how you feel that the government cannot or will not protect you based on, everything you've just told them. Now, in terms of the membership group, remember this is for special protected groups, then specifically it would be race. In other words, that you could show that you're part of the protected groups, in other words, Africa. Now, there are loads of questions on this, and this is why I kept saying in videos that it's really difficult to determine what's going to be accepted and what's not. Because the question is, will the mere existence of BEE, which doesn't necessarily stop individuals from getting a job, I mean, obviously it does limit them and there are reasons and rationalities that's there, but does that stop you getting a job? I don't know if the United States will accept that. Is the fear of persecution and violence purely based on Malema Singh killed a Boer? I don't know. Will they accept that? I don't know. Is it the idea that you could have your land expropriated even though no one's actually had their land expropriated, ergo you can't have fear of that because it hasn't yet happened? Is that enough? I don't know. Who are they defining as an Afrikaner? Yes, they say somebody has Dutch descent, but how do you prove that? I don't know. And to be frank, this should all be detailed in a proper refugee program. And as far as I am concerned, at the time of recording, that program hasn't been finalized. And so anybody that may have been granted refugee status at this point in time is nothing more than a test case as far as I'm concerned. And I'm sure that there are those of you who will disagree with me. But what you would typically tend to expect to see underneath a program like this is something like the Africana Act, which has been proposed, but it hasn't been granted. And so this has left many individuals to ask the question, does that mean that processing of applications won't occur until the framework and the act is finalized, which is proper? That's the way it usually happens. Or are they allowing the processing to occur via the executive order? And there are numerous, let's call them groups, such as the Americanos, who are saying that, yes, that's the case. They are using the executive order to still process applications in accordance with the US RAP. Well, I mean, there hadn't actually been any notice of this apart from some news articles here and there, but nothing formal. And it's not the typical process, especially when the country's not in a war zone and there isn't a immediate humanitarian need. And you couldn't really say in South Africa that there is an immediate humanitarian need. I'm sure there'll be many individuals who will shout at me for saying that. But let's be honest, in war zones where that need usually occurs, such as Syria, people leave the country. They go to the neighboring country. They flee across the borders. They flee for their lives. And no one's fleeing in South Africa. And so for those, some of you will know, I have made a comment before that from my perspective, my personal perspective, some of the rationality for individuals wishing to leave the country is economic. It's not always fear of persecution. It's that my life in South Africa is very difficult because of onerous legislation by the government. And as I previously said, there are other options of individuals, and that would be economic migration through some of the economic migration options available to individuals. And yes, I hear you when you say, well, can't really afford it. I might not be able to afford it. And yes, that may very well be the case. And I do hear you. But the point is, you don't put your life on hold for something that you consider to be that important. And at the moment, the refugee program, I don't know what the status of that is. The news is all over the show. The United States has been really poor at communicating this. And the fact that this news has now come out that some individuals have been granted access is, well, to be frank, surprising to me, only insofar as an actual framework hasn't been created. But look, for those that have been granted their refugee status, we obviously wish you all the best, and we hope that you find everything that you're looking for in your new country of origin. And if that's your route, that's your route. So be it. I'm not here to tell people what to do with their lives. In any case, that's the video. There's nothing more I can really say on this. There is a video tomorrow with Ronaldo where we talk about this a little bit, specifically as to why I made the comments that I made. The video was recorded like a week ago, so obviously things do change in the meantime. But anyway, I await all the keen refugees to tell me why I'm full of BS in the comment section below, because that's usually what happens with these topics. It's one of these emotive topics that just get people fired up. And yeah, I can understand why. People see it as being the ticket to an easier or better life and more safety and economic security. Whether they'll find that in the US or not, I don't know. US is very expensive in my opinion, but everyone to their own. In any case, until next time, bye.